Welcome to episode 70 of 10 Minute Record Reviews, and today we're going to talk about the Jimi Hendrix Experience's debut album, Are You Experienced, which came out in that storied year 1967. One of the few albums that you can say really changed the world, but before and after its release. There are some pretty significant differences between the US and the UK versions of this album. This is the US version, so this one has Purple Haze, it has Hey Joe, and it has The Wind Cries Mary, three massive songs in Hendrix's catalog no matter how you stack it up. The UK version has Can You See Me, Red House, and Remember. Again, all great songs too, so significant differences again between the two releases. This album shot up the charts. There was a lot of buzz about Hendrix before its release until he performed at the Monterey Pop Festival on Paul McCartney's recommendation. He didn't have an album out or a hit single at that particular point. He only appeared through word of mouth, and once he did appear there and the word spread amongst the musical cognoscenti of the West Coast, and by the time this album came out, it roared up the charts. It was only kept off the #1 spot in the UK and the US by Sgt. Pepper's, which is not too shabby, I guess. So a lot of people know pieces of the Hendrix story. I'll just mention a few of them here. He's born in Seattle. He doesn't pick up a guitar until he's 15 years of age, amazingly. Goes into the Army, where amongst other people he meets Billy Cox, one of his later musical collaborators. When he comes out of the Army, he and Billy move to Clarksville, and they start up a band called the King Casuals. He played a lot in the Chitlin circuit. He played for Ike and Tina Turner, played for Wilson Pickett, he played for Jackie Wilson. In 1964, he moves to Harlem. He moves into the Teresa Hotel, which is a famous Harlem landmark, which also played host to Fidel Castro and is the backdrop for a variety of other significant happenings in Harlem over the years. He wins a talent contest at the Apollo Theater. He sits in with various bands, and eventually he ends up getting a gig with the Isley Brothers, which was his biggest gig at that point to date. In the winter of 64 or 65, he's playing with Little Richard, but he gets canned by Little Richard because at this point he's starting to get much more proficient on the guitar and much more flamboyant in his playing style, and that town wasn't big enough for the both of them, I guess. Anyway, Little Richard fires him. At this point, he's really getting tired of being a sideman. He's basically outgrown that particular role. So he forms a band called Jimmy James and the Blue Flames, and they become the house band at the Cafe Wah in Greenwich Village. Keith Richards' girlfriend at the time, Linda Keith, sees Jimmy play, and she bumps into Chaz Chandler, who's a bass player for the Animals. The rest of the story is quite well known. Chandler approaches Jimmy, spirits him off to the UK, hooks him up with Noel Redding and Mitch Mitchell. They do a walk-on appearance at a Cream gig towards the end of 1966 and absolutely blow Cream and Clapton away with their performance, which I kind of always think is a bit of a funny story because I can't imagine a circumstance now where a band like Cream would just have walk-ons. But again, it just goes to show you how different things were at particular points in time. And so there was an enormous amount of buzz already about the band in the UK. Not so much in the US, as I mentioned, but in the UK. Strangely though, they're rejected by Decca Records. The 60s is littered with bad A&R decisions, and this is one of them. They were signed by Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp to Track Records, a very new label. Instantly they go into the studio. Chandler is very much the Svengali behind all of this, and he ensures that Hendrix and Chandler have total artistic control in the studio. And so this album, the technical sophistication of it, the sounds that were created, are very much the product of the production ideas of Hendrix and Chandler. Why is it so great? Well, I think the first thing you have to say is that, and maybe the single biggest thing, is the virtuosity that Hendrix shows in guitar. That's due not only to his incredible technical ability, but also to the fact that he's using Marshall stacks. And Jim Marshall's contribution to the way the electric guitar sounded, the ability to use feedback and distortion and sustain that was achieved through his own amplification is a major difference between listening to this record and listening to records with great performances by good guitarists like Jeff Beck and Eric Clapton and Jimmy Page and Dave Davies just a year or two before, where there is virtually no sustain on the electric guitar. Second reason why this album is so great are all of the essentially studio effects and the sounds that are created. When talking about the technical aspects of this album though, one of the things you really have to point out is the contribution of Eddie Kramer. He helped address what was a major frustration for Hendrix, which was that there was, with a 4-track recording environment, which was very typical, there was perhaps one track left over for guitar overdubs. And what he does is develop a process of essentially mixing down all the rhythm tracks onto one track, leaving multiple tracks available for overdubs. It's no small feat to be able to do this in 1967, just bringing Hendrix's vision to life and having this record sound as mind-blowing as it does. Third reason I think this is so great is the music itself. It's rooted in exactly the same kind of blues and soul that the Beatles and the Stones had been drawing on, but there's something about the way that, even without necessarily having been exposed to these different cultures, he seems to draw on almost every available musical tradition on the planet in bringing the sounds that he does here. I would go so far as to say that I think you can date rock and roll's great inventive period and its great artistic period from the moment of the release of this album. The splash this creates lasts from early 1967 until the mid-1970s, when the Ramones and the Sex Pistols and others began to jolt rock and roll out of this kind of, artistic fever dream it was in and bring it back to its roots. But for that 8-year period, kicked off, I think, by this album, rock and roll was an incredibly artful form and an incredibly vibrant and innovative form, as well as just being popular music. Well, what to say about the songs in this record, about which so much has been said. Purple Haze, unbelievably heavy song for the time. All those things I was saying about Marshall amplification are in clear evidence here. This was a song which changed the notion of what the electric guitar could sound like. Followed up on this version of the album by Manic Depression, a song which has a number of very Hendrixian guitar styles. And in particular, there are examples of kind of the walking riff up the E and A strings. Also, that great kind of tension release between hitting the E string and then hitting a 7th chord, and then back to the E string and back to the 7th chord again. Probably more than any other early song, this is an introduction to how Hendrix was going to play and the kind of contribution and his fusion of blues and jazz and rock styles are very evident here. I also feel that Mitch Mitchell tends to overplay a little bit. He kind of goes to the Ginger Baker school as opposed to staying in the pocket, which frankly, my own personal taste, is kind of what you want a drummer to do a lot of the time. That said, he's working very cleverly in 3/4 time here, and I think this song actually calls for that kind of frenetic playing which he delivers. Third to Hey Joe, which is a song about which I am in two minds. I think you have to say, first and foremost, it's a beautiful song musically. It is, however, bluntly a song about a domestic murder. It tells you a little bit about how male-dominated the rock world was in the 1960s, and subsequently that it's really only recently that people have begun to talk about that particular song and its lyrics. So, great sounding song. Lyrically, these days I find I just can't really get past it, which is a shame because, again, the playing is fantastic and Hendrix's soloing is amazing and it's a wonderfully produced song. So it is what it is. Then you're into two really psychedelic songs, Lover Confusion and May This Be Love. Lots of heavy guitar, but also lots of very dreamy, spacey guitar as well. Both of these cuts must just have blown people's minds, particularly after the relatively straightforward first 2 or 3 songs in the album. And the first side closes out with I Don't Live Today. This is what you might call deep cut Hendrix, but even deep cut Hendrix is pretty damn good. What you hear here is, I think, evidence that Hendrix is every bit the innovator and the virtuoso that Miles Davis or John Coltrane were at around the same time. Hendrix is playing in scales and keys with sounds and feedback that would have been totally unimaginable for pop musicians in 5 years before, in 1962, 63. So it's not just the virtuosity, of which there's tons, it's the inventiveness here, which makes me think of Coltrane and Davis. Side 2 starts with what may be my favorite Hendrix song of all time, which is The Wind Cries Mary. This is an album that's spacey, trippy, and it's got some quite manic passages in it. This, by contrast, is a peaceful poem of a song, which has the same kind of airiness that his cover of All Along the Watchtower would have a little bit later. It's airy and light, and yet there's still that touch of very satisfying heaviness in the turnaround with those three chords. It's also amazing to listen to all the different moods and tones he summons just in the outro for the song alone. This song is basically a piece of genius. Followed by Fire, which is one of the tracks where Noel and Mitch both get to shine. This is, frankly, just a great, sexy rock song. One of the great things about Hendrix is that you often feel when you're listening to the tracks that the take that you're listening to on an album might have been wildly different through a variety of different takes, and you just happen to be in a particular moment in time in the song that you're listening to, and this is an example of that. Third Stone from the Sun. I love the main melody here. It's a little bit sort of druggy and trippy sounding, but it is fundamentally a beautiful piece of melody, which would be beautiful regardless of the style of music in which it was being played. Foxy Lady, another Hendrix classic, another sexy rock song, another great example of that E string 7th chord alternation just to give that sort of tension and release. Wonderful tune. And then the album concludes with the title track, Are You Experienced?, which is just mind-blowing, trippy stuff for 1967 and just puts a cap on the inventiveness and the complete difference of this record from everything which came before it. And you can just imagine that whether you're an ordinary person or you were a rock star or a virtuoso guitarist, people must just have sat in their chairs after this album finishes playing and just said sort of holy shit to themselves. It was that out there, that amazing, that important in the history of the development of rock and roll. In its own way, I think it's a very strong contender for the best rock album ever. I could see for some people who, if you're not necessarily interested in an album where the players are constantly, particularly the guitarist, is constantly trying to push the boundaries of what's possible with their instrument every damn song, and you're looking for something a little more consistent, I could see why not everybody would want to listen to this all the way through. For me, however, I'm very happy with that approach, and this is a timeless listen again and again and again. 5 stars out of 5 for me.